I accidentally found my old credit card that I hadn't seen in 10 years. When I went to the bank to check the balance, the manager went pale. "Ma'am, the balance is $29 million. I had never earned that kind of money when I found out." Good day, dear listeners. It's Anna again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. Eddie, and also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. Some mornings the past has a way of finding you when you're not looking for it. I remember the exact date I found the card. A Saturday in early October, when the Virginia maple outside my kitchen window had turned the color of old rust. I was cleaning out the attic, something I had put off for 3 years. The way you put off anything that forces you to touch the edges of a life you've already buried. There were boxes up there I hadn't opened since the divorce, 10 years of avoidance stacked neatly under dust. My name is Claire Harmon. I'm 48 years old. I teach AP History at Jefferson High School in Richmond, Virginia, and I have done so for 19 years. My students call me Mrs. Harmon out of habit, even though I haven't been anyone's wife since 2014. I live alone in a 3-bedroom colonial on Westover Hills Boulevard. Too large for one person, not large enough to feel like anything other than a reminder. I keep a vegetable garden in the back. I grade papers on the porch. I drive a 2017 Honda Accord with a cracked side mirror I've been meaning to fix for 2 years. That was my life, and I had made a kind of peace with it. Careful, quiet, self-contained, safe. The divorce from Richard Harmon had been what people charitably call complicated. We'd been married for 11 years. He ran a private investment and consulting firm, Harmon Capital Group, and I had trusted him the way you trust the ground beneath your feet, which is to say completely, and without ever thinking about it. When the marriage ended, I was too exhausted and too heartbroken to fight. I signed what his lawyer, a reptilian man named Philip Crane, put in front of me. I was told our joint accounts had been settled and closed. I was told the numbers were accurate. I believed them. That, as it turned out, was the most expensive thing I ever did. But I didn't know any of that on that October Saturday. I was just a woman standing in a dusty attic, pulling open a cardboard box labeled Office Misc, and finding beneath a stack of old tax returns and a broken stapler a credit card. It was a Citibank card, navy blue with a holographic stripe that caught the attic light. Claire A. Harmon was embossed across the front in raised silver letters. The expiration date read June 18th. Expired for more than 6 years. I had no memory of this card. None. I didn't recognize the account number. I didn't recognize the bank branch listed on a small sticker on the back. I sat down on an old suitcase and turned it over in my fingers for a long time. The dust motes drifting around me in the afternoon light. When did I get this? Why don't I remember it? I almost threw it away. I nearly dropped it in the black garbage bag I was filling, with old phone chargers and broken picture frames, and the accumulated debris of a former life. But something stopped me. Some small, stubborn instinct I hadn't used in years. I set the card on top of the nearest box and kept working. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the card in front of me and my laptop open. I searched the account number. Nothing public. I searched the bank branch code on the back. A Citibank branch in Arlington, Virginia. I had never lived in Arlington. Richard's firm had an office there. I noted that and told myself it meant nothing. I told myself that for 4 days on Wednesday, I drove 40 miles to the Arlington Citibank branch during my lunch break. I was still telling myself it meant nothing. I was still prepared for the teller to smile and say, "Ma'am, this account has been closed for years. There's nothing here." I had practically written the scene in my head. I would feel mildly foolish, drive back to Richmond, and grade my students' essays on the causes of World War I. The branch manager's name was David Okafor. He was a composed, professional man in his early 40s, and he had the kind of steady face that doesn't surprise easily. He took the card to the back office, asked for my ID, made a phone call I couldn't hear, and returned to the glass-walled conference room where I was waiting. I will never forget the color that left his face. He sat down across from me very slowly, the way people sit when they need a moment to decide what to say. He set a printed statement on the table face down. He looked at me, then at the paper, then back at me. "Mrs. Harmon," he said quietly. Are you aware of the current balance on this account? I assumed it was 0, I said. He turned the paper over. I looked at the number for a long time. I looked at it the way you look at something that cannot be real, the way you look at a shadow that moves against the light. $29,041,8807.54 $29 million in an account with my name on it that I had never touched, never seen, never known existed. Is this some kind of error? I asked. David Afer shook his head very gently. No, ma'am, he said, it is not. I drove home in silence. I don't remember the road. I sat in my car in the driveway for 40 minutes before I could make myself go inside. And as I sat there in the dark, staring at my cracked side mirror, one thought rose above all the others, slow and inevitable as a tide. Richard knew about this account. Richard had always known. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table until the maple outside the window went from black to gray to the pale amber of early morning, and I let myself think through things I had spent 10 years refusing to think about. The statement David Okafor had given me told a story. If you knew how to read it, the account had been opened in 2009, 5 years before the divorce, under both our names with an address in Arlington. I had never signed any opening documentation, which meant either my signature had been forged or Philip Crane had manufactured a paperwork trail during the divorce proceedings that conveniently made this account disappear. The earliest deposits were modest. $50,000 here, $80,000 there. But by 2014, the year of our divorce, the balance had climbed to just over $4 million, fed by a series of large wire transfers from an LLC I didn't recognize. Meridian Solutions Group. After the divorce, the deposits continued. The account had been managed, invested, compounded. 37 separate transactions over 10 years, some of them 7 figures. Someone had been tending this money like a garden while I taught teenagers about the New Deal and drove a car with a cracked mirror. How had I not known? How had I signed the settlement and walked away from $4 million? Because I had trusted them. Because Philip Crane had given me documents labeled full asset disclosure, and I had a lawyer who billed me $300 an hour and apparently never looked hard enough. Because Richard had sat across from me in a mediation room and looked me in the eye and told me everything was accounted for. I made coffee I didn't drink. I walked from the kitchen to the living room to the back porch and stood in the cold morning air looking at my garden. The tomato plants dead and brown, the soil turned for winter. I was afraid. I want to be honest about that. Richard Harmon was not a physically violent man, but he was the kind of man who knew how to apply pressure in ways that left no fingerprints. During the marriage, I had watched him dismantle a business partner's career with 3 phone calls and a letter. I had watched him smile while doing it. Philip Crane was his instrument, sharp and expensive, and entirely without conscience. If I moved against them, they would know, and if they knew, they would move first. But here was the other thing I understood. Standing there in the October cold, $29 million does not sit in an account with your name on it and belong to someone else. Not legally, not in the United States of America, with a paper trail and a bank manager who had already seen my ID. Whatever story Richard and Philip had constructed, the foundation had just cracked open. The question was not whether I could fight. The question was whether I was willing to. I went back inside and opened my laptop. I didn't search for lawyers yet. First, I needed to understand exactly what had been taken from me. I spent 3 days in my own dining room, which I converted into something resembling a research station. I pulled out every document I had from the divorce, the settlement agreement, the asset disclosure sheets, the correspondence from Philip Crane, the emails from my own attorney, a decent but not exceptional man named Gerald Park, who had since retired to Florida. I made a spreadsheet. I cross-referenced the account statement David Afor had provided against every figure in the settlement disclosure. The account did not appear anywhere, not once. It had been cleanly, surgically excised from the paperwork as though it had never existed, but it had existed since 2009. I had 10 years of bank statements to prove it. I called in sick to school on Thursday. I never called in sick. By Friday evening, I had what I needed to understand the scope of it. Richard and Philip Crane had concealed a minimum of $4 million in assets during our divorce proceedings. The remaining $25 million was growth, 10 years of management and investment, but the underlying fraud was the concealment. In Virginia, intentional concealment of marital assets during divorce is grounds for the court to reopen a settlement. I had looked that up at 200 a.m. on a legal information site, reading it 3 times to be sure, and then I made a decision. I was not going to call Richard. I was not going to contact Philip Crane. I was not going to mention the account to anyone in my life, not my colleague Sandra, not my sister Beth in Charlotte, not a single person until I had spoken to an attorney. The right attorney, not Gerald Park and his gentle inefficiency, someone who specialized in exactly this, financial fraud in divorce proceedings. I wrote down 3 names from my research. The first name on my list was Nancy Walsh. She had a small firm in downtown Richmond on East Carey Street, 3 blocks from the James River. Her website was spare and professional. No stock photos of gavels and scales. Her bio said she had spent 6 years as an assistant U.S. attorney before entering private practice, and that her focus was complex financial litigation and family law. A review from a former client read simply, "She does not lose." I called her office at 8:05 Monday morning, the moment they opened. "I need to speak with Nancy Walsh," I told the receptionist. "It's regarding a divorce settlement from 2014 and a concealed account with a balance of approximately $29 million. There was a brief pause. "Let me see when she can see you today." The receptionist said, "I had my first appointment at 11 a.m. I dressed carefully that morning. Dark blazer, pressed slacks. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror before I left. I didn't look like a woman who had just found $29 million. I looked like a high school history teacher who hadn't slept properly in 5 days. But somewhere behind my eyes, something had changed. Something had settled into place, the way tumblers settle in a lock. I had been patient for 10 years without knowing I was waiting. Now I knew what I was waiting for. Nancy Walsh was not what I had imagined. I had expected someone severe, a woman who wore her competence like armor. What I found was someone compact and quiet with reading glasses, pushed up into gray, stringing with her whole body still, the way good doctors listen. Her office on East Carey Street was lined with bookshelves and smelled like paper and coffee. She shook my hand once firmly, sat across from me, and didn't speak for the first 30 seconds after I laid everything on her desk. The bank statement, my copies of the divorce documents, my spreadsheet. She put on her glasses and read. She read for a long time, longer than I expected. Outside her window, the James River glittered in the October mid-morning light, and a delivery truck ground its gears on the street below. And Nancy Walsh read every page without speaking. Finally, she set the papers down. She looked at me over her glasses. "Do you understand what you're looking at?" she asked. "I think so," I said. "He hid assets." "He didn't just hide assets," she said. "He laundered them through an LLC to make them untraceable during the disclosure period. He filed false documentation with the court. And based on what I'm seeing here, his attorney assisted in structuring the concealment. That's not just civil fraud, Mrs. Harmon. If the transfers were made across state lines, and at least 3 of these appear to have been, we're potentially looking at wire fraud under federal statutes." She said this very calmly. "The way you describe weather. What does that mean for me?" I asked. "It means," she said, "that you have a strong case to reopen the settlement under Virginia Code Section 20107.3. Courts can set aside a divorce decree when fraud is proven. It also means Richard Harmon and Philip Crane may be looking at criminal exposure, which changes the nature of their incentives considerably." She paused. "It also means they will fight you very hard." "I know," I said. "Do you?" She looked at me steadily. "These are people who have had 10 years to build walls around this money. They will have answers for everything. They will have alternative explanations. They will make you look unstable, opportunistic, and confused. I have seen this done to intelligent, credible women, and it works if we let it." She folded her hands on the desk. "So, here's what we do. First, we don't move publicly. We build the record quietly. I file a formal discovery request directly with Citibank under the right legal framework, requesting the complete account history. Every deposit, every transfer, every originating account. I also subpoena the corporate filings for Meridian Solutions Group. If that LLC was set up specifically to funnel money before the divorce, its formation documents will show us who signed them and when. I nodded. My hands were steady in my lap, which surprised me. There's one more thing, Nancy said. Don't contact Richard. Don't contact Philip Crane. Don't change anything about your daily life. If they realize you found this account before we have the documentation in order, they will move money. Even with the account frozen, which we'll seek as soon as we file, they have time to complicate things. How long until we file? I asked. 3 weeks, she said. Maybe 4. I want everything airtight. I drove back to Richmond and taught my afternoon classes. I stood in front of 23 16-year-olds and lectured about the economic causes of the Civil War. And I don't think any of them noticed that their teacher was holding a secret the size of a mountain. 2 weeks later, the Citibank records arrived at NY's office. She called me on a Tuesday evening, and her voice had a different quality than it usually did. Not excitement exactly, but the particular gravity of someone who has found exactly what they were looking for. Come in tomorrow morning, she said. I need you to see something. I sat across from her the next morning and looked at what Citibank had provided. 147 pages of complete account history, going back to the account's opening in March 2009. Nancy had highlighted certain transactions in yellow. She walked me through them methodically, the way she must have walked juries through evidence in her prosecutor years, building the picture piece by piece. In September 2013, 14 months before our divorce was finalized, there had been a wire transfer of $2 million into the account from Meridian Solutions Group. The corporate filing for Meridian Solutions, which Nancy had obtained separately, listed 2 officers, Richard James Harmon and Victor Shale, his business partner. Meridian had been incorporated in Delaware in August 2013, 12 months before Richard told me he wanted a divorce. The company had no public-facing business, no website, no clients, no product. It existed for one purpose: to move money. In the divorce disclosure Richard had filed with the court, Meridian Solutions Group did not appear, not once. Nancy set a final document on top of the pile. It was an email obtained through the Citibank legal compliance request. An internal message Richard had sent from a Harmon Capital Group account to a Citibank relationship manager in Arlington, dated November 2013, re-account ending 71041Ds. Please ensure correspondence goes to Arlington office only. No statements to the residential address. My wife has joint nominal status only for estate purposes. I read it twice. Joint nominal status only. He had put my name on the account as a legal formality, perhaps to establish plausible deniability, perhaps for estate structuring, while ensuring I would never receive any communication about it. He had used my name and my legal identity to house money he intended to keep from me, and then during the divorce, he had erased it from the record. I looked up from the email. Nancy was watching me. This is the document, she said. This is the one that proves intent. He didn't accidentally fail to disclose this account. He engineered its invisibility before the divorce proceedings even began. She paused. Claire, this is the point of no return. Once I file, there's no doing this quietly anymore. He will know, and everything that follows will be a war. The room was very still. Outside, East Carey Street hummed with its ordinary Tuesday traffic. Someone was playing music in a car below. Life continuing, indifferent. File, I said. Nancy filed the petition to reopen the divorce settlement on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, Philip Crane had called her office 4 times. She told me this with the mild satisfaction of someone who had expected exactly this response. He's rattled, she said. Rat people make mistakes. She had also filed an emergency motion to freeze the account pending litigation, which the court granted within 24 hours. $29 million locked. Neither Richard nor I could touch it. I taught my Friday classes, came home, and found my car. Someone had scratched 3 long lines across the hood of my Honda Accord, deep, deliberate gouges from the front left corner to the windshield. I stood in my driveway in the cold evening air and looked at it for a long moment. Then I went inside, called Nancy, and sent her photographs. Document everything, she said. Save every communication you receive. If anyone contacts you directly, Richard, Diana, Philip, anyone, you tell me immediately and you do not respond. Richard contacted me directly the next morning. He called from a number I didn't recognize, but I knew his voice instantly. 10 years hadn't changed it. It was the same measured, reasonable tone he had used in the mediation room. The tone that sounded like fairness while it was building a cage around you, Claire. He said, "I think we need to talk like adults." "Contact my attorney," I said, and ended the call. He called 3 more times over the weekend. I didn't answer. On Sunday evening, a car I didn't recognize idled outside my house for 20 minutes before driving away. I noted the time, the make, the partial plate, and sent it all to Nancy. She forwarded it to the police, filing a report. Diana came on Monday. I was pulling into my driveway after school when I saw her standing at my front door in a camel coat, dark hair, perfect, the picture of composed indignation. Diana Harmon was 41 years old, 7 years my junior, and she had married Richard 2 years after our divorce. I had never spoken to her directly. I had seen photographs. She was beautiful in the architectural way that requires significant maintenance. "Claire," she said, stepping toward me as I got out of the car. "I know this looks bad, but you need to understand Richard has already talked to his lawyer, and what you're doing is going to end very, very badly for you. This money is tied up in business structures that you don't understand. You could walk away with a reasonable settlement right now and save yourself years of 'I'd like you to leave my property,'" I said. Her composure cracked just slightly. "Don't be stupid," she said. "You're a school teacher. You don't know what you're getting into." "Leave my property," I repeated, "or I will call the police." She left. I went inside and sat on the kitchen floor for a few minutes, which was not something I would normally do. Then I got up, made tea, and called Nancy to report the visit. The next escalation came from Philip Crane. A letter arrived by courier. Formal, meticulous, and designed to be frightening. It alleged that the account had been established as a business holding vehicle, that my nominal joint status had been documented and explained to my own counsel during mediation, a lie I now had the email to disprove, and that any attempt to claim personal ownership would constitute tortious interference with a legitimate business entity. The letter was 12 pages. It had footnotes. I read it once, set it in a folder, and sent it to Nancy. She called me that evening. I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "He's building his defense in writing," she said. "Every word of that letter is going to matter in court, and about half of it contradicts documents we already have." She paused. "Claire, they're scared. Scared people overreach." The court date for the preliminary hearing was set for 6 weeks out. I had 6 weeks to hold. I held. But on the last Friday of October, Nancy called and told me something I hadn't expected. The court had not only frozen the account, but it also issued a preliminary ruling that the circumstances warranted a full evidentiary hearing. Philip Crane's motion to dismiss had been denied. We were going forward. "Go somewhere quiet this weekend." Nancy told me, "You've done everything right. Let it rest for 2 days." My friend Sandra Burgess, who taught English at Jefferson and had known me for 15 years, had a house on the Outer Banks in North Carolina, which she rented out in summer and left empty in October. She handed me the key on Friday afternoon without asking any questions. That was the kind of friend Sandra was. I drove down Saturday morning, 4 hours south, through flat tobacco country and pine barrens, and arrived at a gray shingled cottage 3 rows back from the Atlantic. The beach was empty. The October ocean was the color of slate, and the wind came in cold and hard off the water, and I walked along the shore for 2 hours without thinking about anything at all. For the first time in 3 weeks, I slept through the night. I came back from the Outer Banks on Sunday evening, rested in a way I hadn't been in years. The stillness didn't last long. On Monday morning, a letter from Philip Crane's office arrived at NY's firm, formally styled as a settlement proposal. Richard was offering me $900 ZWU to be paid in 2 installments, structured as a retroactive correction to the 2014 divorce settlement, in exchange for my withdrawal of the petition and a signed NDA that would prevent me from discussing the account, the litigation, or anything related to Harmon Capital Group with any party for the remainder of my natural life. Nancy read it to me over the phone. 900,000 I repeated against a balance of $29 million, she said. I was quiet for a moment. $900,000. More money than I had ever had at once. More than 3 years of my teaching salary, and enough to pay off my mortgage, replace the Honda, take the trip to Italy I had been deferring for a decade. It was real money. It was designed to feel like real money. What do you think? I asked Nancy. I think you should do whatever you decide is right, she said carefully. But professionally, I think they are offering you 3 cents on the dollar, because they believe you can be frightened into taking it. If they believed you didn't have a case, they wouldn't be offering anything. Tell them no, I said. I heard the quiet in her voice that meant she'd expected that. I'll respond formally tomorrow. What I didn't tell Nancy, what I didn't tell anyone yet, was that the days at the beach had done something more than rest me. Walking that empty October shore, I had understood something I hadn't been willing to look at clearly before. This wasn't just about money. $29 million was an abstraction. What it represented was not. Richard had stood in a mediation room and sworn under oath that he had fully disclosed all marital assets. He had lied. He had forged or manufactured documentation. He had engineered my departure from our marriage, with the deliberate intention of leaving me with nothing, while he walked away with everything. He had counted on my trust, my grief, and my ignorance. And for 10 years, it had worked perfectly. The 900,000 was still counting on my fear. I declined to be afraid anymore. Or rather, I decided that fear was no longer a reason to stop. But I also knew I couldn't do this alone, not psychologically. I had Sandra, who knew nothing beyond the fact that I was in some legal business. I had Nancy, who was my attorney, not my friend, and I had myself rattling around in a 3-bedroom house, dealing with scratched car hoods and women in camel coats on my doorstep. I started looking and I found a support group. It was called Recovered Ground, a nonprofit based in Richmond that offered peer support for women who had experienced financial abuse in marriage and divorce. They met on Wednesday evenings at a community center on Broad Street, 12 to 15 women in folding chairs in a beige room with terrible fluorescent lighting, drinking bad coffee and telling the truth. I went the first Wednesday in November. I sat in the back. I didn't say much. I listened. The woman who ran the group was named Marian Collins. She was 63 with close-cropped silver hair and the no-nonsense warmth of someone who had seen everything and retained her compassion through the seeing. She had been a family law paralegal for 20 years before her own marriage ended in what she described as a masterclass in legal manipulation. She had started Recovered Ground 8 years earlier. After the meeting, she poured me a cup of terrible coffee and sat next to me. "First time?" she asked. "That obvious?" "You're the only one who didn't take a cookie," she said. "People who've been coming a while have learned to take the cookies. It's not much, but it helps." I laughed. It surprised me. A real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded. I went back the following Wednesday and the one after that. Marian's group didn't give me legal advice or financial counsel. What it gave me was something more fundamental. The understanding that what had happened to me was not a personal failing, neither that I had not been foolish or weak. I had been deliberately deceived by people who were skilled at it. That's a different thing entirely, and the distinction matters enormously when you are deciding how hard to fight. The women who win, Marian told me one evening as we stacked chairs after the others had left, aren't the ones who are the angriest. They're the ones who get the angriest and then get very, very calm. I thought about that on the drive home through the November dark. I was getting very calm. They came on a Saturday. I was in the back garden turning the dead vegetable beds for the last time before winter when I heard the doorbell. I walked around the side of the house, still holding my garden fork, and found Richard and Diana standing at my front door. Richard was in a charcoal overcoat. He had aged well and he knew it. Silver at the temples now, the kind of distinguished gray that men acquire and women are supposed to apologize for. Diana stood slightly behind him, her expression arranged into something she intended to read as concern. They looked like a couple who had come to offer condolences. I did not open the screen door. Claire, Richard said, I know we've had a rough few weeks. I was hoping we could sit down and talk like reasonable people without the lawyers for once. You're not supposed to contact me directly, I said. Your attorney is aware of that. I know. And I know this isn't strictly. He tried a small self-deprecating smile. He was very good at small, self-deprecating smiles. Claire, I owe you an apology. The way the account was structured was complicated, and I understand that from the outside it looks like fraud, I said pleasantly. Your attorney can discuss it with mine. Diana stepped forward. Her mask slipped slightly at the edges. I could see it. Claire, I want to be direct with you. Woman to woman. Richard has worked extremely hard to build what he's built. This account represents years of legitimate business proceeds. What you're trying to do is take money that legally and ethically belongs to his business, and you are going to destroy his career and his reputation, and I won't pretend this doesn't affect me personally. Then don't pretend, I said. She blinked. Diana, I said. You married a man who committed perjury in a courtroom and hid $4 million from his wife while she was grieving the end of their marriage. That's who you chose. I'm not responsible, Claire's throat, for the consequences of his choices. Richard's pleasant expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went flat and cold. I had seen that look before, once years ago, when a contractor had disputed a bill, and Richard had calmly told him to expect trouble. The contractor had quietly dropped the dispute. Claire, he said very quietly, I'm trying to give you an opportunity to resolve this in a way that works for everyone. The alternative is years of litigation, depositions, your finances, your life, your testimony examined by my legal team. We will find every inconsistency, and I want to be clear about this, every vulnerability in your case and in your history. Is that really what you want? There it was. Under the apology, under the concern, under Diana's woman-to-woman sincerity, the same blade he had always used, wrapped in the same reasonable voice. Get off my property, I said. Both of you now. Claire, I'm going to count to 10, and then I'm calling the police. I'm also going to send my attorney a recording of this conversation. I held up my phone, which I had started recording when I heard the doorbell. I had learned one. They left. I went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a few minutes. I'm not going to claim I was completely unmoved. My hands were not entirely steady. Richard's voice, even after 10 years and everything I now knew, still carried a residual weight. The way things do when they have been the defining sound of your life for over a decade. And his threat was not empty. Litigation is brutal regardless of which side you're on. And Philip Crane was very good at what he did. But here was what I noticed. The fear was there, and it was also fuel. I was afraid of what they might do. And that fear clarified everything with perfect precision. It reminded me exactly what was at stake. Not money, though the money was real. What was at stake was the decade of my life they had already taken, the quiet poverty of my 3-bedroom house, and my cracked car mirror, and my careful small existence. While Richard and Diana lived in a colonial revival house in Imlan on $29 million that partly had my name on it. I sent the recording to Nancy. She called me back within 15 minutes. They just handed us a gift, she said. Coming to your home after a no-contact directive from the court attempting to persuade you to withdraw litigation. I'm filing a motion for contempt first thing Monday. Good, I said. I called Marian that evening. She didn't say much. She mostly listened the way she always did. But at the end, she said, Do you know what the word contempt means in law? A violation of court order, I said. No, she said gently. In Latin, it means to despise. They held the court in contempt, because they hold you in contempt. They think you're still the woman who signed the papers without looking. She paused. Make sure they find out otherwise. The evidentiary hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in December in the Richmond Circuit Court, Courtroom B, 3rd floor. My husband, Ethan, had just driven out of sight when my 7-year-old daughter leaned close and whispered, Mom, run right now. I stared at her. What, Lily? What's wrong? She was trembling so hard her teeth nearly clicked. Don't ask. We have to get out of the house now. The terror in her eyes kept me from arguing. I grabbed my purse, took her hand, and rushed toward the front door. That was when it happened. The first sound was not an explosion. It was a deep, metallic groan beneath the kitchen floor, low and unnatural, like the house itself had taken a breath. Then the windows burst. The force threw me sideways before I could reach the porch. My shoulder struck the entryway wall. Lily's hand slipped from mine, and the air filled with heat, glass, and a violent roar that seemed to swallow every other sound. For one suspended second, I could not see her. I could not hear her. All I could think was that I had let go. Lily. My voice came out broken. Smoke rolled through the hallway, gray and thick, and somewhere behind me, wood cracked with the sharp pop of gunfire. I dropped to my knees, crawling over shattered picture frames and splintered trim, calling her name until my lungs burned. Then I heard a tiny cough from the porch. She had made it through the doorway. She was curled against the brick column outside, one hand pressed over her ear, blood running in a thin line down her shin. I lunged toward her, pulled her against my chest, and half carried, half dragged her across the front lawn. Behind us, flames pushed through the kitchen windows. Our neighbor, Mr. Halpern, was already running from his garage in socks and a Cardinals sweatshirt. "Get away from the house," he shouted. The gas line could go again. I scooped Lily up and kept moving until we reached the sidewalk across the street. My knees gave out there. I sat hard on the curb, clutching her while alarms began sounding from every direction. First smoke detectors, then car horns, then the rising wail of fire engines. Lily buried her face in my neck. "You listened?" she whispered. I looked down at her. Of course I listened, but I did not understand what she meant. 10 minutes earlier, our morning had been ordinary. Ethan had stood at the kitchen island in a pressed blue shirt, scrolling through emails while I packed Lily's lunch. He was supposedly driving to Indianapolis International Airport for a 3-day business trip to Chicago, where his software company had meetings with potential investors. He complained that the coffee was weak, kissed Lily on the top of her head, and reminded me that the garage door had been sticking again. "Call someone before it freezes up completely," he said. I had laughed. "You mean call someone before you get back and have to deal with it?" He gave me that familiar crooked smile. Exactly. Nothing about him had seemed frightened. Nothing had seemed final. He kissed my cheek at the door, picked up his leather carry-on and said, "I'll text when I land." Then his SUV rolled down Hawthorne Ridge Drive and disappeared beyond the curve. The moment it was gone, Lily changed. She had been sitting at the breakfast table in unicorn pajamas, pushing blueberries around her plate. Suddenly, she slid out of her chair and hurried toward me. Her face had gone pale. That was when she whispered for me to run. Now, sitting beneath the red flash of emergency lights, I replayed every second. The suitcase, the coffee, the kiss, his calm voice telling me to fix the garage door. A paramedic knelt beside us. Her name tag read Monica. "Ma'am, I need to check both of you." "I'm fine," I said automatically. "You were inside an explosion." That sentence cracked something open in me. I looked back at the house, at the black smoke pouring through the roofline, and finally understood that the place where I had made birthday cakes, folded laundry, and waited for my husband to come home was no longer safe. Monica checked Lily first. A superficial cut on her leg, ringing in one ear, no obvious signs of concussion. I had bruising along my shoulder and several small cuts across my hands. She wanted us transported to the emergency room, but before we left, a fire investigator approached. He introduced himself as Captain Ruiz and spoke carefully, as though every word might frighten me further. "Mrs. Isa Bennett, do you know of any gas problems in the home?" "No." "Any recent repairs to the stove, furnace, or water heater?" "No, nothing." "Did you smell gas this morning?" I shook my head, then looked at Lily. Her whole body stiffened. Captain Ruiz noticed. "Sweetheart, did you smell anything strange?" Lily stared at the pavement. I stroked her hair. "You're not in trouble." She pressed closer to me and whispered, "I don't want Daddy to be mad." A cold sensation moved through my chest, deeper than fear. Why would Daddy be mad? She would not answer. At the hospital, my sister Rachel arrived before Ethan did. She came rushing through the emergency department in yoga pants and a winter coat thrown over a t-shirt, her hair still damp from the shower. She wrapped both of us in her arms and cried against my shoulder. "What happened?" "I don't know." "Where's Ethan? I've called 6 times. His phone went straight to voicemail." That made no sense. He should have been on the interstate, not in the air. I called again and again until a nurse gently asked me to put the phone away so she could clean the glass from my palm. Ethan finally called nearly 40 minutes later. His voice sounded breathless. "Claire, what happened?" The police called me. The house exploded. There was a pause, too brief to accuse, too long to forget. "Oh my God," he said. "Are you and Lily okay? We got out." "How?" I looked across the curtain at Lily sitting on Rachel's lap with a hospital blanket around her shoulders. She told me to run. Another pause. Then Ethan said very quietly, "She did." By the time he reached the hospital, he was crying. He pulled Lily into his arms, kissed her face, and kept saying, "Thank God, thank God." Anyone watching would have seen a terrified husband and father. I saw that too, but I also saw Lily turn her face away from him. Later, when Ethan stepped into the hallway to speak with the fire department, Lily crawled into my bed. She tucked herself under my arm and waited until his footsteps faded. Then she looked up at me, tears filling her eyes. "Mommy," she whispered. "Daddy knew." I didn't answer Lily right away. I simply stared at her. Hospitals have a strange way of making time stand still. Machines beeped somewhere beyond the curtain. Nurses spoke in calm voices that somehow made everything feel more serious. And outside the narrow window, the gray Indiana sky hung low over the parking lot. But inside my head, everything was suddenly moving too fast. Daddy knew. The words refused to leave me alone. "Lily," I whispered carefully, "why would you say that?" Her little fingers twisted the edge of the blanket until her knuckles turned white. I heard him. Before she could say another word, Ethan stepped back into the room carrying 2 cups of coffee. His eyes were red, and his shirt was streaked with soot from walking around what remained of our house with the fire investigators. "There are my girls," he said softly. Lily immediately lowered her head. It was subtle. If I hadn't been looking directly at her, I probably wouldn't have noticed. She had always run toward her father. She adored him. He was the one who built backyard forts, taught her how to ride a bike, and spent Saturday mornings making chocolate chip pancakes that were never quite cooked in the middle. Now she wouldn't even look at him. Ethan handed me a cup. "Captain Ruiz said they're treating it as a gas explosion until they know more." I nodded. They asked whether we'd ever smelled gas. "No, they'll probably have answers in a few days." Again I nodded. He seized my shoulder. "We're lucky." "Lucky?" I looked through the window toward the ambulance bay. If Lily hadn't whispered when she did, neither of us would still be alive. That wasn't luck. That was something else. Rachel insisted we stay with her. "You are not getting a hotel," she said as she loaded our overnight bags into her SUV. "And you're definitely not trying to rent a place tonight." Her husband, Mark, agreed immediately. "The guest room's yours for as long as you need." Their house sat only 15 minutes away in another Carmel neighborhood, close enough that Lily could continue attending her elementary school without changing districts. By evening, the local news had already reported the explosion. Neighbors texted constantly. Church friends offered meals. Parents from Lily's 2nd grade class asked whether she needed clothes or school supplies. It reminded me why I had always loved living there. People showed up, not because they had to, because that's what neighbors did. Ethan spent most of that first evening on the phone. Insurance, his office, the mortgage company, the restoration contractor. I understood all of those calls. What unsettled me was how organized he seemed. He had already created a spreadsheet listing damaged property. He talked about replacement values, temporary housing reimbursement, coverage limits, personal property claims. He was efficient, too efficient. Rachel noticed it too. Late that night, while Ethan was outside taking another phone call, she quietly asked, "Is it just me, or does he seem strangely focused?" I defended him automatically. "Everyone handles trauma differently." "I know." She hesitated. "I'm just surprised he hasn't stopped crying over almost losing you." I didn't answer because until she said it, I hadn't noticed. As 3 days passed, investigators searched what remained of the house. Insurance adjusters photographed every room. Friends brought casseroles we barely touched. Lily stopped sleeping through the night. She woke crying almost every evening, insisting the lights stay on. A child psychologist explained that this was normal after traumatic events. I wanted desperately to believe that was all it was. But every time I remembered those words, Daddy knew. The knot in my stomach tightened. On the fourth evening, Ethan drove back to the property with the insurance adjuster. Rachel took Mark to one of his physical therapy appointments. For the first time since the explosion, Lily and I were alone. She sat at the kitchen table coloring butterflies. I made us grilled cheese sandwiches. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, I sat beside her. Honey. She didn't look up. You said Daddy knew. A tiny nod. What did you mean? Silence. I reached across the table and took her hand. You are safe. Another long silence, then it was my fault. My heart nearly stopped. No. She finally looked at me. I wasn't supposed to hear. Hear what? She swallowed. I was hiding. Hiding where? In the basement. The memory came back to her slowly in broken pieces. The previous Saturday, Ethan had suggested a family game of hide and seek. Lily had hidden beneath the basement stairs. It was one of her favorite hiding places. No one ever looked there. She waited quietly. She expected to hear me searching. Instead, she heard the basement door open. Daddy came downstairs. He wasn't alone, not physically. He was talking to someone on speakerphone. Lily couldn't see him. She could only hear. I stayed really still, she whispered. I thought if Daddy found me, I'd lose. She smiled sadly at that innocent thought. Then her face crumpled again. I heard Daddy say. She squeezed her eyes shut. After I leave, I felt every muscle in my body go rigid. What else? Nobody will be inside. She took a shaky breath. It'll look accidental. The room suddenly felt too warm. My hands were ice cold. What else did you hear? I don't know. She started crying. I couldn't hear everything. That's okay. I tried. You don't have to remember. But I do. She covered her face. I remember, he said. The insurance company. Those 3 words landed like stones. Insurance company. My mind immediately rejected the possibility. No, there had to be another explanation. A business discussion. A client. A completely different situation. Because the alternative was impossible. I pulled Lily into my lap. You didn't tell me because you thought Daddy would be angry. She nodded against my shoulder. I wasn't supposed to hear. You did nothing wrong. I thought maybe. She began sobbing. Maybe the house got hurt because I listened. I hugged her tighter. Oh, sweetheart. Children see themselves at the center of everything. When something terrible happens, they often believe they somehow caused it. No, I whispered firmly. This was never your fault. She cried for a long time. I cried with her, not because I believed Ethan had done anything. Not yet, but because somewhere inside me, a tiny crack had appeared. The kind that begins so small you tell yourself it isn't there, until one day the whole foundation gives way. That night, after Lily finally fell asleep, I sat alone on Rachel's back porch. The air smelled of fresh cut grass. Fireflies blinked across the yard. My phone buzzed. It was Captain Ruiz. Mrs. Bennett, he said gently. I wanted to let you know we've completed our preliminary examination. I held my breath. We're no longer treating the explosion as a routine accident. My fingers tightened around the phone. What does that mean? It means, he replied carefully, we found something that requires a much deeper investigation. My entire world shifted. Because for the first time, I realized Lily's frightened whisper might not have been the imagination of a traumatized little girl. It might have been a warning. I barely slept after Captain Ruiz's phone call. Rachel found me sitting at her kitchen table just before sunrise, wrapped in one of her oversized sweatshirts, staring into a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. You've been up all night, she said quietly. I nodded. They found something. She sat across from me without asking another question. What kind of something? I don't know yet. That wasn't entirely true. I knew enough. Enough to realize the investigation had changed. Enough to understand that Lily's terrified whisper might not have been the frightened imagination of a 7-year-old child. Enough to know I couldn't afford to ignore my instincts anymore. Rachel reached across the table and squeezed my hand. What are you going to do? I looked out the window. I need facts, not accusations, not theories. Facts. Theory. That afternoon, I met with my attorney, Linda Mercer. Linda had handled my parents' estate years earlier, and later helped Rachel through a difficult custody dispute. She was practical, calm, and almost impossible to intimidate. After listening without interrupting, she folded her hands across her desk. Claire, I want you to hear me very carefully. I am If your husband committed a crime, the police will investigate it, I understand. But if he didn't, accusing him too early could destroy your marriage for nothing. I know. She studied my face. So don't confront him. I frowned. Not yet. Not until you know what you're dealing with. Her advice made sense. Emotion wanted answers. Logic demanded evidence. I'd also like you to meet someone, she continued. A private investigator. She shook her head. A forensic accountant? I blinked. Why? Because if this was financially motivated, money will tell the story long before people do. 2 days later, I sat across from Daniel Reeves. He wasn't what I expected. No expensive suit, no flashy office. Just a quiet man in his early 60s, with reading glasses balanced near the end of his nose, and 30 years of experience tracing financial fraud. He asked only one question before opening his notebook. How involved are you in your family's finances? I smiled awkwardly. I pay household bills. Retirement? Ethan handles it. Investments? Him. Business accounts? I've never seen them. He nodded, as though he had heard the same answer 1,000 times. That's more common than you think. I suddenly felt embarrassed. Not because Ethan managed the finances. Because I had trusted him so completely that I had stopped asking questions years ago. Daniel explained exactly what he intended to review. Tax returns, mortgage records, public filings, business registrations, insurance policies, bank activity that could legally be obtained. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just paperwork. You'd be amazed, he said with a faint smile. How often people hide the truth in plain sight. Life settled into a strange routine. Rachel drove Lily to school every morning. I volunteered in her classroom one afternoon so she wouldn't feel alone. Watching 7-year-olds argue over crayons and spelling words felt oddly comforting. Children continued living, even after explosions. Lily slowly smiled again around her classmates, but every afternoon she checked the windows before sitting down to do homework. Once she quietly asked, "Are we staying here tonight for a while?" She nodded. I like Aunt Rachel's locks. I looked toward the deadbolt on the front door. She had started checking it every evening, sometimes twice. No 7-year-old should know what fear like that feels like. Nah. Ethan was almost never home anymore. Or rather, almost never at Rachel's house. He claimed he was meeting with contractors, insurance representatives, engineers, and his company's investors. His schedule sounded reasonable. Yet, something had changed. He had become strangely impatient. Every conversation somehow drifted back to insurance. The adjuster says replacement costs are higher than expected. The policy should cover temporary housing. I hope they don't delay the claim. One evening over dinner, he even asked, I wonder how long it'll take before the insurance company releases the first payment. Rachel looked at him. So soon? He shrugged. We have to move forward. Move forward. Our home had exploded less than 2 weeks earlier. Our daughter still woke crying almost every night, and Ethan seemed obsessed with paperwork. I told myself grief affected everyone and him. Still, a quiet voice inside me kept asking the same question. Why was he so worried about money? 3 days later, Daniel called. I have enough to meet. His voice sounded unusually serious. We met in a small conference room above his office. He slid several folders across the table. Everything I'm about to show you comes from legitimate public records and financial documents. I nodded. The first document was our mortgage. Or rather, a mortgage I didn't recognize. I don't understand. Daniel adjusted his glasses. Your husband refinanced your house 8 months ago. What? You signed electronically. The sentence died before I finished it. Then I remembered 8 months earlier, Ethan had asked me to sign several online documents while I was making dinner. He had said they were routine banking updates connected to our home equity account. I hadn't even read them. I trusted him. Daniel quietly continued. The refinance increased your debt substantially. My stomach tightened. Why? He withdrew nearly $400,000. What did he do with it? I don't know. He opened another folder. This is more concerning. It was our homeowner's insurance policy. A new policy issued just 5 months before the explosion. Coverage had increased dramatically. Structure, personal property, additional living expenses. Everything. Is this unusual? Not by itself. He pointed toward the effective date, but combined with the refinance, he let the sentence hang. Then came the business records. The Ethan software company had looked successful from the outside. Inside, it was collapsing. Several contracts had been canceled. Revenue had fallen sharply. There were outstanding loans, personal guarantees, investor demands. The company wasn't growing, it was bleeding money. I felt physically sick. So he was in trouble. Daniel nodded slowly. Significant trouble. Could insurance money solve it? It wouldn't solve everything. He paused. But it would buy time. Time. Enough time to avoid bankruptcy. Enough time to satisfy angry investors. Enough time to keep pretending. I stared at the mountain of paperwork. The evidence still didn't prove Ethan had caused the explosion, but it proved something equally important. He had a reason to be desperate. We're free. The next morning, Captain Ruiz called again. His voice was even more careful than before. Mrs. Bennett, I wanted you to hear this from us before rumors begin. I stood alone on Rachel's back porch. What happened? Our forensic team completed its examination. My heartbeat quickened. The explosion was not caused by an old pipe. I closed my eyes. There was no equipment failure. A long silence followed. Finally, I forced myself to ask, then what caused it? We found evidence that someone deliberately loosened a gas connection. The words echoed in my ears. Deliberately, not accidentally. Not naturally. Deliberately. Captain Ruiz continued. From this point forward, this is officially a criminal investigation. After we hung up, I stood outside for several minutes without moving. Rachel eventually opened the back door. Claire. I turned toward her. For the first time since marrying Ethan 12 years earlier, I realized I was no longer trying to prove my husband innocent. I was trying to discover how guilty he really was. But I made one decision before walking back inside. I would tell Ethan nothing. Not about the accountant. Not about the refinance. Not about the insurance policy. Not about the criminal investigation. If he believed I still trusted him, he might make the mistake that finally revealed the truth. Keeping a secret from your own husband is a lonely thing. Keeping one because you no longer know whether your husband tried to destroy your life is something else entirely. For the next week, I became an actress. I smiled when Ethan smiled. I thanked him when he brought takeout home. I sat beside him during meetings with the insurance adjuster and nodded as though I still believed we were simply an unlucky family trying to recover from a terrible accident. Inside, I watched everything. Every word, every expression, every silence. It wasn't easy. For 12 years, I had trusted this man with every part of my life. Now, I found myself wondering why he asked certain questions, why he always wanted updates from the insurance company before asking how Lily had slept, why he checked his phone whenever Captain Rue's name appeared on my screen. The hardest part was pretending none of it bothered me, because if Ethan truly was involved, the one thing I couldn't do was let him know I suspected him. Nato. Lily returned to school full-time. She smiled more often now, though she still insisted on sleeping with the hallway light on whenever we stayed at Rachel's house. One afternoon, while helping her with second-grade math homework, she suddenly asked, Mom, yes, sweetheart, do grown-ups always tell the truth? The pencil stopped moving in my hand. I'd like to think they try, but not always. No, she looked down at her workbook. I don't want Daddy to lie. Neither did I. But wanting something doesn't make it true. I kissed the top of her head. Whatever happens, you never have to carry this by yourself again. She leaned against my shoulder. I'm glad I told you, so am I. Those 5 words gave me more strength than she could ever understand. 2 days later, Daniel called again. I finished tracing the refinance money. I drove straight to his office. He spread another set of documents across the conference table. The $400,000 didn't disappear. Where did it go? Into the business. I wasn't surprised. What kind of business expenses? He pointed towards several highlighted entries. Loan payments. Another page. Payroll. Another. Emergency capital. Then he looked directly at me. Claire, Ethan's company wasn't just struggling. He took a slow breath. It was weeks away from failing. I stared at the paperwork, but he kept telling me everything was fine. I'm sure he wanted you to believe that. I remembered family barbecues where Ethan confidently discussed expanding the company, the vacations he insisted we could afford, the new SUV, the expensive watch he'd bought himself the previous Christmas. The life I believed we were building. It had all been balanced on a cliff I never knew existed. Daniel slid one final document toward me. This one concerns me the most. It was a timeline. Mortgage refinance, insurance increase, business losses, investor demands, everything fit together in chronological order, like pieces of a puzzle or steps in a plan. I suddenly felt sick. Not because I finally believed Ethan had done something, because I was beginning to understand how someone might convince himself he had no other choice. Dirta, that Friday afternoon, Captain Ruiz asked me to come to the fire department. He was no longer alone. A detective introduced herself as Karen Wallace, from the county sheriff's office. She spoke gently. "Mrs. Bennett, we're going to share some information that cannot leave this room." I nodded. Captain Ruiz turned a computer monitor toward me. "We obtained security footage from 3 homes on your street. The first video showed Ethan leaving our driveway that morning. Exactly as I remembered. He waved. He drove away. Normal. Then another camera appeared. A neighborhood entrance several blocks away. Timestamp, 9:24 a.m. The detective paused the video. Watch the lower right corner. A dark SUV entered the frame. It slowed, then turned onto a side street that eventually connected back toward our neighborhood. I recognized it instantly. Ethan's vehicle. He came back. Detective Wallace nodded. He never continued toward the interstate. I couldn't breathe. The next camera showed the SUV parked behind a small church less than half a mile from our house. The timestamp only minutes before the explosion. He told me he was halfway to the airport. He wasn't. I covered my mouth. There had to be an explanation. A forgotten laptop, a flat tire, anything. Detective Wallace quietly continued. "We also obtained his cell phone location records through a warrant." Another map appeared. His phone matched the security footage exactly. He had returned. He had stayed nearby. Then he left only after emergency vehicles began arriving. Every instinct I had spent weeks trying to suppress suddenly came rushing to the surface. I heard myself whisper, "Oh, Ethan." The investigation moved quickly after that. Search warrants uncovered deleted messages from Ethan's business phone. Most had been erased. Several were recovered. One exchange caught everyone's attention. Unknown. Timing matters. "Ethan, I know they'll be gone." Unknown. No mistakes. There were no direct references to our house. No mention of gas. No explicit confession. But taken together with everything else, the picture was becoming impossible to ignore. A week later, Detective Wallace invited me back. This time, she didn't bring files. She brought honesty. "We believe we understand what happened." I sat perfectly still. "Ethan never intended to be inside the house." "I know. We also believe he expected you and Lily to be out before the explosion." I frowned. "What?" She leaned forward. "The timer appears to have been set for later than the actual ignition. I don't understand." "Our best theory is that he believed the house would be empty." The room spun, so my voice barely worked. "He wasn't trying to kill us." She answered with heartbreaking precision. "We don't believe that was his objective." For one impossible second, I actually felt relief. Then she finished the sentence. "But he was willing to risk your lives." The relief disappeared instantly because she was right. Whether he wanted us dead or merely accepted the possibility, the difference no longer mattered. He had gambled. The stakes had been our daughter, our marriage, our lives. He had rolled the dice anyway. I walked out of the sheriff's office in silence. I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes before turning the key. When I finally reached Rachel's house, Lily ran outside to hug me. I held her longer than usual. That evening, after she fell asleep, I opened my laptop without crying, without shaking, without saying a single word to Ethan. I completed the online intake form for a divorce. Not because I hated him, because I finally understood the man I thought I had married no longer existed. Or perhaps he never had. I wasn't ready to confront him. Not yet. The criminal case needed to finish. The evidence needed to speak, and when the time finally came, I wanted the truth, not my anger, to destroy the life he had built on lies. The knock came at 6:18 on a Tuesday morning. It was still dark outside. Rachel had just started the coffee maker, and I was packing Lily's lunch while she searched for her favorite purple hair tie upstairs. For one impossible second, I thought about pretending no one was home. Then I looked through the front window. 3 sheriff's deputies, 2 investigators, and a man in a navy windbreaker with large white letters across the back. FBI. Rachel looked at me. I didn't have to say anything. She already knew. I opened the door. Detective Karen Wallace gave me a small, respectful nod. Mrs. Bennett, we're executing an arrest warrant this morning. I swallowed. He's here. Ethan had spent the previous night in Rachel's guest room. After claiming he was exhausted from meetings with contractors and insurance representatives. Venti. He had become almost strangely affectionate over the past week, hugging Lily longer than usual, asking me whether I was sleeping, telling me everything would be all right. Looking back, I realized he wasn't comforting us. He was comforting himself. One deputy quietly asked, "Where is he?" "Down the hall, first room on the left." The house remained silent for another 30 seconds. Then I heard footsteps, a door opening, someone saying, "Sir, keep your hands where I can see them." Ethan's confused voice followed. "What is this?" Another voice. "You are under arrest." Rachel gently closed the front door before Lily could come downstairs. She looked at me. "I've got her." I nodded. Please, no child should ever watch her father being handcuffed, no matter what he had done. The local news spread the story before lunchtime. The headline no longer described an unfortunate gas explosion. Now it read, "Software executive charged in alleged insurance fraud scheme." Neighbors called. Friends texted, some cried, some apologized. A few admitted they had secretly wondered why Ethan seemed more worried about paperwork than about almost losing his family. One message stayed with me. It came from our next-door neighbor, Mr. Halpern. I kept thinking I was imagining things. The morning of the explosion, I thought I saw Ethan's SUV come back through the neighborhood. I told myself it couldn't have been him. Neither of us had wanted to believe what our eyes had seen, because believing it meant accepting that someone we knew, someone we trusted, could make a decision like that. Paul federal investigators soon joined the case. Insurance fraud involving interstate financial transactions had expanded the investigation beyond the county. Detective Wallace explained everything carefully. The financial evidence helped establish motive. Daniel's work had mattered: the refinance, the hidden debts, the increased insurance coverage, the failing company. Separately, none of it proved guilt. Together, it painted a picture that jurors could understand: a man drowning in debt, a desperate attempt to save everything at someone else's risk. Ethan's business collapsed almost immediately. Investors withdrew. Clients canceled contracts. Employees began searching for new jobs. The board removed him as chief executive within 48 hours of his arrest. I genuinely felt sorry for those employees. They had families, mortgages, children. They hadn't chosen any of this. Greed rarely destroys only the greedy. It leaves wreckage everywhere. The weeks that followed became a blur of interviews, legal meetings, and therapy appointments for Lily. She had started drawing again. Almost every picture included the same thing: a little girl holding her mother's hand. The child psychologist smiled gently when she showed me. "She's processing safety." I fought back tears. "I hope one day she won't have to." "She won't forget," the therapist said. "But she can heal." Those words became my anchor. Healing didn't mean pretending nothing had happened. Healing meant refusing to let what happened define the rest of our lives. The prosecutor asked whether I would be willing to testify, so long as Lily doesn't have to. "She's our priority too," he assured me. They already had enough evidence: financial records, forensic reports, security camera footage, cell phone location data, recovered messages, witness statements. My testimony would explain the marriage. Lily's testimony would explain the motive. No one wanted to put a 7-year-old through that if it could be avoided. I silently thanked every person working that case. Justice should never come at the cost of a child's peace. Months later, I saw Ethan for the first time since his arrest. Not at home, not in jail, in a conference room inside the county courthouse. Our attorneys had arranged a settlement discussion related to the divorce. He looked older, much older. His expensive suits were gone. His shoulders slumped. His confidence had disappeared. For several long moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked at me. "I never wanted either of you to get hurt," I believed him. Oddly enough, that didn't comfort me, because I had already learned the most dangerous people are not always the ones who want to hurt you. Sometimes they're the ones who convince themselves that everything will work out, that the risk is acceptable, that bad things only happen to other families. I looked directly into his eyes. You keep saying that. His voice cracked. Because it's true. I nodded slowly. I know. He seemed surprised. Then I continued. You didn't have to want us dead. The room fell silent. You only had to decide our lives were worth risking. He closed his eyes. For the first time since all of this had begun, he had no answer, no explanation, no excuse, only silence. As I walked out of the courthouse, I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt lighter. Not because Ethan had finally heard the truth, because I no longer needed him to understand it. Real revenge isn't watching someone suffer. It's reaching the point where their choices no longer control your future. That evening, Lily met me at Rachel's front door with a handmade card. Across the front, she had written in uneven second-grade handwriting, "Welcome home, Mom." Not "welcome back." Not "I'm sorry," just "welcome home." For the first time in months, I realized home wasn't a building. It wasn't the house we had lost. It wasn't even the marriage I had believed in. Home was the little girl waiting with open arms, and no one, not even the man I once trusted more than anyone, would ever be allowed to gamble with that again. The criminal case ended almost a year after the explosion. Not with a dramatic courtroom showdown, not with some shocking last-minute confession. It ended the way many real cases do, with a negotiated plea agreement. The prosecutor called me the afternoon before the hearing. Ethan has agreed to plead guilty. I closed my eyes. What changed? He accepted responsibility for insurance fraud and the related criminal charges. More importantly, he agreed not to force Lily to testify. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I quietly asked, "Will she ever have to take the stand?" No, I thanked him, not because I was happy. Because a little 7-year-old girl would never have to sit in a courtroom and relive the worst morning of her life while looking at her father across the room. If that alone felt like a victory. The sentencing hearing lasted less than an hour. I attended because I believed I owed it to myself, not because I wanted to watch Ethan suffer. The courtroom was almost full. Former employees, reporters, a few neighbors. His parents sat silently in the second row. His mother looked 20 years older than I remembered. My heart broke for her. She had lost a son without burying one. When the judge summarized the evidence, everything sounded strangely clinical. The refinance, the increased insurance coverage, the hidden debts, the altered gas connection, the security cameras, the recovered messages, facts, simple, unemotional facts. Yet each one represented a choice Ethan had made. The judge paused before imposing sentence. Mr. Bennett, greed often disguises itself as desperation. You convinced yourself that because you did not intend the worst possible outcome, you were free to risk innocent lives. The courtroom remained perfectly still. That is not how responsibility works. I glanced toward Ethan. His head never lifted. For the first time in many months, I didn't see my husband. I saw a man who had spent years making one compromise after another, until he could no longer recognize the line between solving a problem and creating a tragedy. When the hearing ended, I quietly walked away. I never looked back. The divorce became final 6 weeks later. There were no arguments left, no negotiations that mattered. His remaining assets were divided according to the law, and after debts and legal obligations were settled, I received a fair portion through the divorce settlement. It wasn't enough to replace the life we had lost. Nothing could, but it was enough to begin again. Rachel hugged me outside the courthouse. So she smiled. What now? I surprised myself with the answer. We build something smaller, not because I had to, because I wanted to. Hey. 3 months later, Lily and I moved into a modest 3-bedroom house in Westfield, just north of Carmel. It wasn't the biggest home on the block. There were no soaring ceilings, no oversized kitchen island, no custom staircase. The backyard was smaller. The driveway was shorter. The mortgage was comfortably within my budget, and for the first time in years, every dollar that paid for it was honest. The first night, Lily helped me unpack dishes while music played softly through a portable speaker. She carried one box at a time, proudly announcing where everything belonged. My room feels safe, she said. Those 4 words meant more to me than any luxury Ethan and I had ever owned. That weekend, we planted flowers beside the front porch. Neighbors walked over to introduce themselves. An elderly couple from across the street brought homemade banana bread. A retired firefighter, offered to help install new smoke detectors. A young family invited Lily to ride bikes with their children. Life didn't magically become perfect. It simply became normal. And after everything we'd survived, normal felt extraordinary. My therapy remained part of our routine. Once every 2 weeks, Lily met with Dr. Hernandez. Gradually, the nightmares became less frequent. She stopped checking every lock twice before bed. She laughed more. She slept through the night. One afternoon, nearly 18 months after the explosion, she climbed into the passenger seat after school with an unusually serious expression. "Mom, yeah." She looked down at her backpack. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." She hesitated. "Did I save you?" The question caught every bit of air in my lungs. I pulled into a quiet parking lot beside a neighborhood park. Then I turned off the engine. I reached across the center console and took both of her little hands. "You saved both of us." Her eyes filled with tears. "I was so scared, I know. I thought Daddy would be mad forever." I gently brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "You did something incredibly brave." I didn't feel brave. I smiled through my own tears. "That's because courage doesn't usually feel brave while you're doing it." She leaned across the console and I held her as tightly as I had. On the morning we escaped our house. Only this time, neither of us was shaking. As life settled into its new rhythm, I found myself wanting to help families who had experienced house fires and other disasters. The local fire department organized a community safety event every autumn. Captain Ruiz invited me to speak. Not about Ethan, but about preparedness. I almost declined, then I realized something. For months, that explosion had defined me. Perhaps it was time to redefine it. Standing beside Captain Ruiz and several firefighters, I spoke to young parents about smoke alarms, emergency plans, and something many people never discuss: listening to your children. "They don't always have the right words," I told the crowd. "Right. But sometimes they notice things adults overlook." Several parents nodded. One little boy squeezed his mother's hand. I smiled. Maybe our story could protect another family. Maybe pain didn't have to be wasted. Sometimes people still ask whether I hate Ethan. The honest answer surprises them. No, I don't hate him. Hatred would keep him living rent-free inside my heart. Instead, I learned something far more valuable. Trust should never be blind. Love should never require silence. And no amount of money is worth gambling with the people who believe in you. The greatest revenge wasn't watching Ethan lose his career, his reputation, or his freedom. The greatest revenge was building a peaceful life he could never take from us. A life where my daughter laughed without fear. A life where every lock on every door existed simply because it should, not because we were terrified. A life built on truth instead of deception. If you've stayed with me through this story, I hope you'll remember one thing. Greed rarely begins with one terrible decision. It begins with small compromises, tiny lies we tell ourselves until they become impossible to escape. And if you're ever fortunate enough to have someone who trusts you completely, protect that trust, because once it's broken, no amount of success, money, or regret can ever truly buy it back. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment when your instincts or the words of someone you loved changed your life? Your story might encourage someone else who needs hope today. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about resilience, justice, and second chances, please consider subscribing and joining us for the next journey.